In the previous video, we considered several different arguments for why someone might be a subjectivist about morality, why someone might think that ethics is relative to whatever your society happens to say. And we concluded the video by considering Hume's is-ought problem, which suggested that we needed to introduce some sort of value claim about us in order to get any kind of a normative claim about what we ought to do. And if it turns out that values are not objective, if they're not actually out there in the world, something that we can scientifically investigate, then we might have to take a subjective view of morality. What I want to do now is consider an alternative way of thinking about objectivism, an alternative way to be an objectivist about morality, one that does not necessarily require the claim that values have to be objective or that we have to somehow go out and scientifically discover what we call human values. So let me try to explain what I have in mind here. I think that there's two forms of objectivity. There's two different ways that we can think about what we mean by something being objective. So let's return to what Aristotle said about ethics. Remember, he said that it's an inexact science. It's a science of the circumstances of life. Let's accept this, at least for the sake of our current discussion. Now, notice that science is objective in two different ways. On the one hand, science is empirical. It investigates reality or what objectively exists. We go out and make observations. We run experiments. So in that regard, science is considered objective. A different way in which we can think about how science is objective is to think about the rational methods that we use to investigate reality. If those rational methods turn out to be objective, then that would count as a different way, a legitimate way nonetheless, but a different way of being objective. To illustrate this point, consider something like mathematics or logic. Generally speaking, people think that mathematics and logic are objective. Mathematics is thought to be universal. It applies to everyone, everywhere, no matter who you are, no matter where you happen to live. Logic is the same way. Logic applies universally, no matter who you happen to be. Mathematics and logic are objective in the second way, though. They're not objective insofar as we can go out and scientifically investigate or discover what a number is. There are no numbers. There are no sets. These things are abstract objects. They're not physical objects that we can observe or investigate from a scientific perspective. So if mathematics and logic are to be objective, then they have to be objective in the second way. So the mere fact that many people think correctly, I would say, that numbers and sets are abstract objects, they don't literally exist. Nonetheless, we can think of mathematics and logic as being objective. But what exactly is the difference between numbers and sets and human values? If you accept the claim that numbers and sets don't literally exist, but we can still be objective about mathematics and logic, then why couldn't we also be objective about morality, even though human values don't exist? So that's the general point that I think is interesting and helpful to keep in mind. Just to summarize the idea here, arguably, even if human values are like numbers and sets insofar as they don't literally exist, they're not a part of the physical world, this does not automatically mean that we are unable to be an objectivist about mathematics and logic. Ditto for ethics. Morality is objective in this sort of way, in the same way that mathematics and logic is objective. So now let me try to put some meat on the bones to flesh out this in a little more detail. The basic idea then is someone could hold that ethics and morality is objective or universal rather than being subjective or relative to one's culture, because we have an objective, rational method of thinking about moral issues and solving moral problems. That is to say, we have an objective and rational method for doing moral reasoning in the same way that we have an objective and rational way of doing logical or mathematical reasoning. And this is what's known as a priori reasoning. So let me try to spell out what that is. What is exactly a priori reasoning and what is a priori knowledge? Well, a priori is Latin and it basically means before experience. right? So we don't have to go out in the world to gain any knowledge. We don't have to go out in the world to know that, for instance, 2 and 3 equals 5. You can know that 2 and 3 equals 5 simply by sitting in your armchair and thinking about it. Or think about what the definition of a square is. You can come to the definition of a square and thereby have knowledge, mathematical knowledge regarding what a square is, simply by considering what it means to have 4 angles in an enclosed object, or a triangle to have 3 angles in an enclosed object, or a circle to have no angles in an enclosed object. We can use these definitions in an a priori manner to do some mathematical reasoning and then thereby have some mathematical knowledge. This form of a priori reasoning and knowledge needs to be distinguished from what's known as a posteriori reasoning or a posteriori knowledge. What we mean by a posteriori, again, this is Latin, and it means based upon experience or due to experience. So this would be what we generally take science to be, right? We go out and make some observations in the world, we experience certain things, we collect some data, and then we do some reasoning, we make some inferences, and we establish some knowledge based upon this experience that we've had, based upon going out in the world and observing certain things. So you might think that even if moral reasoning is not objective in the a posteriori sense, nonetheless, it could still be objective in the a priori way. Likewise, you might think that moral knowledge is impossible in the a posteriori sense, but it is possible in the a priori way. So, if it's the case that moral reasoning is like mathematics and logic, then we can be an objectivist about morality, and we can have objective moral knowledge in the same sort of way that we do with regard to mathematics and logic, which is to say that we can be an objectivist in the second sense, even if we cannot be an objectivist in the first sense. Therefore, we would now be in a position to say that we have some grounds or some fundamental basis for morality. We can say that what grounds morality is simply the fact that we have rational and objective methods for solving moral problems. Now, you might still disagree, but at least we have some sort of approach. We don't have to entirely abandon an objective view of morality. Now, of course, if you reject this sort of approach to how we might take an objectivist position regarding the grounds of morality, you would need to give some sort of objection. You would need to argue for your position. And that's fine. If that's the view that you hold, you just have to be able to defend your view. But at least at this point now, we've considered at least some way to both be a subjectivist as well as an objectivist with regard to what might ground morality.